Hey everyone, it's ArtzDeeva, and I made an entire Left 4 Dead storyboard series last year. Let's talk about what I learned from the process.
Suck on this! Yeah!
Watch out!
Go! We are kicking ass! Yeah, baby, yeah!
Reloading! Yeah!
Woo! Get some, baby, get some!
So I've been struggling on making any videos about the behind-the-scenes process for Left 4 Dead: The Return. There's so many different approaches I could take, so many aspects I could talk about. It's really overwhelming, to be honest, but I figured I could at least start from the perspective of what this experience has taught me. I've got a lot to talk about, so if I don't address some things you're curious about in this video, don't worry, I'll do it in another one. Alright, let's start off with pre-production. Obviously, the first thing I needed to do to make this series was write a script and drop thumbnails. I drafted the script over the summer of 2021, continuing to make edits and revisions into the fall just before I started work on episode 1. But to be perfectly honest, I was still making edits to the script and story even into production of the last episode. Sometimes that's not a bad thing. In animation, the story can change quite a bit through most of pre-production and actual production, but had I spent more time re-evaluating the script and story before launching into storyboarding, I might have saved myself some extra stress and time. For example, Nick's origin flashback in episode 2 was way shorter than the final scene, but I realized that in my attempts to keep to deadlines, I was rushing the flashback too much. So I slowed it down by showing Nick and Tony discussing the auction before commencing with the montage and the ultimate betrayal. You want to know how many additional thumbnails that amounted to? 50. 50! And that's not even taking into account any later revisions I made to that scene. Keep in mind also that I made this revision right as I was beginning production on episode 2 itself. Yikes. So, now I know that once pre-production's over, I should probably make sure my story is as solid as it can be before moving on. Another thing that helps with this is simplicity. Simplicity is the very thing that makes the Left 4 Dead games sing. I tried my best to keep this in mind with both the writing and the execution of the storyboards. I kept the goals of the group very simple, just like the campaigns: get to a safe place, or figure out a new plan of action. In episode 2, I struggled a lot with what to do when the survivors were taken to the military, but I quickly realized I was making things too complicated. Once I scaled back my ideas and focused on what needed to happen, it was a lot easier to plan a sequence of events and write them into the script. This is just as important as re-evaluating the script, especially if you're doing this all by yourself, like I did. I like to think that I remember all the rules of camera work, and yet somehow I still found myself crossing the 180-degree line. There are also times when I could have just pushed for more striking or improved angles and acting. There's also the issue of knowing if you're putting enough or too much into a scene. For example, in episode 2, I not only revised the script for Rochelle and Ellis's origin flashbacks, I even revised the thumbnails themselves to make them more dynamic. In case you haven't caught on already, episode 2 was easily the hardest one to make. So yeah, if I could go back in time, I would have looked over the thumbnails multiple times before storyboarding to make life easier for myself. I think that about covers it for pre-production. Let's move on to the next stage. If we want to start off from the very beginning, let's talk about that hand intro. Oh my god, it was so much fun to make, but it was pretty chaotic. I did my best to be prepared before filming, but there were certain things I didn't prepare for, especially where time is concerned. The time it took to do makeup and mud on my hand, the time it took to set up the lighting, and the bugs. I find my organizational skills can be quite selective, so in the future I would work harder to make sure all my bases were covered and I was as prepared as I could be. I was a lot better with organizing the storyboards. There were folders for each scene within each episode, and every board was titled 1 through whatever to make viewing and editing easy. This also applies to sound collecting and mixing. I kept music from the games separate from music from YouTube's audio library. There were individual files for individual survivor dialogue within each piece. Of course, once I got to episode 3, organizing and compiling sound files got a bit hairy. But even still, it pays to keep everything in its place as much as possible. This seems like a no-brainer, but for a long-term project like the L4 Dead series, this was something I sucked at first, and slowly got better with in time. I've had pain problems with my hands in the past, so whenever I found myself pushing harder, I had to take a step back. And then there were times when life happens. During episode 1, there was a death in the extended family, and during episodes 2 and 3, I was having some of the worst mental health days of my adult life thus far, not to mention having to attend a lot of appointments. I didn't always take those things into account when planning my day, and sometimes it would screw me over. Luckily, the L4 Dead project taught me a lot about how to improve those things, and now I'm a lot better with taking breaks. If my body is in pain or discomfort, I don't work, or I do things like go for a walk or ice my wrist. If a day is super hectic, I adapt to that and plan for the days when I know I'll have more time to work on stuff. I understand now that rest is a part of the creative process, and working on the series helped me to honor that. It's often said that animation is 70% music and sound. After working on the series, I truly believe it. In order to create an immersive story that still felt like a L4 Dead experience, it was critical to use the music, voice lines, and sound effects from the game. The Horde music was separated in layers, so I had to put those back together by ear. I had to create whole choirs of angry zombies so that I wouldn't be throwing in a million sound effects into a video file. And there were lots of survivor conversations that had to be put together. I'm not gonna lie, it was tedious at times. Grueling even, but it did give me a greater appreciation for the amount of detail that Valve put into their sound design for the games. And hey, at least arranging the survivor conversations were fun, especially in episode 3. And when I needed music or sound effects that the L4 Dead games couldn't give me, I turned to good old YouTube audio library. I tried to pick music that either matched the emotions of the scenes or fit the audio aesthetic of the L4 Dead games, preferably both if I could. But, I mean, it's YouTube audio library. They don't have the right stuff for everything. Overall, this was definitely an area where I felt a little out of my league. I got an A in my audio class in college, but I swear I barely remember a thing from it. The textbook was so dense, and the class itself did not feel well suited for a total noob like me who hadn't even touched Audacity yet. There's plenty of little mistakes, clunky fades, and uneven volume throughout the series. So if nothing else, I came out of the series with more of a desire to learn how to get better with basic sound design. Finally, let's move on to my favorite stage, post-production. I've always underestimated the amount of time it will take to edit a video, and boy oh boy did this come back to bite me hard with the L4 Dead series. Because this wasn't just a short 2-minute video like I've usually made in the past. Before it was split into pieces, episode 1 was freaking 35 minutes long, episode 2 was 45 minutes long, and episode 3 was slightly shorter than episode 1, but still, these weren't just small things to throw together. And even though I did my best to prepare as much of the sound and music ahead of time, it was a long process making sure everything was placed. And it took time when I had to go back into the directory because I forgot something. Editing the boards wasn't quite as tedious as the sound, but it still required attention. I had to set them up within the black borders and prep all the transitions and camera moves before bringing in sound. And then, there was the subtle wiggle effect I added onto every shot. I added this to give a slight jittery sense of movement, sometimes increasing it for action-heavy scenes, but doing that on my potato PC was a lot. The big lessons I learned from the editing process were to double the time it takes to edit and have as much ready and prepared as possible. I know for a fact that doing so will save me so many headaches and moments of stress. Speaking of stress and my previously mentioned potato PC, here's another thing I learned the fun way. This PC I was working on had served me well the last few years. It had been there for me with all my college assignments, but it was barely there with the L4 Dead project. Actually, that's unfair to the PC. It did pretty well, all things considered. But because it was older and couldn't accept any more updates for anything, that made rendering a nerve-wracking process. For those who don't know or remember, the plan was to originally upload each episode in its entirety, but when I rendered episode 1 like that, there were these weird glitches on the footage. I didn't know what specifically was causing them, and I didn't know how to fix them. I was up till 1 in the morning losing my mind over this, by the way. So it was then that I decided to split the video into parts. I knew the computer could handle videos between 10 to 15 minutes at the longest. Of course, as of writing this, I now have a brand new custom-built computer that could easily handle the workload of the L4 Dead series today. But if I could go back in time, I would have updated everything so I could work with more ease and less stress. In the end, I think the biggest lesson I learned in making the L4 Dead series was that of commitment. I've never pulled off a big project like this before, and while I've tried writing or storyboarding other ideas in the past, I would often eventually abandon them, and because of that, I'd be too nervous to set deadlines because I knew deep down I couldn't keep them. Making L4 Dead: The Return was the beginning of breaking this cycle. I chose to believe fervently in this thing, and while I always set deadlines, I learned to not fear them, because if something came up and I had to adjust, I could always change the deadlines. And it wasn't the end of the world if I had to. As long as I was committed, it didn't matter if the work got done sooner or later. It would be done. I started to finally embrace the marathon, not a race mentality. There's still so much I can talk about the making of L4 Dead: The Return, so I will leave it up to you curious viewers to decide what specific aspect I talk about next. You want to know more about the writing, storyboarding, editing? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll talk about it the next time we return to the making of this series. In the meantime, that's all for now. ArtzDeeva over and out.